What's the problem? What's the problem? What's the problem?
Someone killed my parents.
Pardon me?
Someone killed my parents.
August 20th, 1989, Beverly Hills, California. In this city of glitz and glamour, where appearances are everything, a brutal crime was about to shatter the silence of one of the wealthiest neighborhoods. Inside a grand mansion on Elm Drive, the bodies of Jose and Kitty Menendez lay in a scene of unimaginable horror. A powerful, wealthy family, admired by many, had been violently torn apart. But this wasn't a random act of violence, it was personal. The Menendez family seemed to embody the American dream. But inside these walls, a nightmare was unfolding, one that no one would have expected. When police entered the Menendez mansion that night, they found a scene of unparalleled brutality. Jose Menendez, a prominent entertainment executive, lay sprawled on the couch, his body riddled with shotgun blasts. Beside him, his wife, Kitty, lay motionless, her body showing signs of a desperate attempt to escape. Jose's face was nearly obliterated. The force of the shotgun blasts rendered him almost unrecognizable. Kitty, too, was shot repeatedly. Blood stained the walls, the furniture, and the floor, a silent testament to the viciousness of the attack. For the detectives on scene, this was no ordinary murder. The violence, the overkill, this was more than a random robbery gone wrong. It felt calculated, deeply personal. They were left to wonder, who could harbor such hatred? It was a mystery that would soon capture the nation's attention and tear apart everything people thought they knew about family loyalty, wealth, and justice. In the early hours following the murder, a desperate call came through to 911. It was Eric Menendez, the youngest of Jose and Kitty's two sons. His voice cracked with terror.
Beverly Hills emergency?
Yes, please.
What's the problem? What's the problem? What's the problem?
Someone killed my parents.
Pardon me?
Someone killed my parents.
What? Who? Are they still there?
Yes.
The people...
No.
Were they shot?
Hey, man,
Were they shot?
Yes.
They were shot?
Yes.
What
happened?
I have a hysterical person on. We're trying to get screen further. Other units responding. Is the person still there?
What happened? We have units around. What happened? Who shot who? I don't hear anything. I just came home. You came home and found who shot? My mom and dad.
You know if they're still in the house, the people that did the shooting.
Get away from me. Okay. Hey, let me talk to Eric. Who is the person that was shot? My mom and my dad. Your mom and dad? My mom and my dad. Okay, hold on a second. Okay, we're on our way over there with an ambulance. Okay, I gotta go. Okay. Hello, this is police department. Yes. Okay, I want you to come outside. Okay, just come out the front door. I never seen my brother.
Someone killed my parents. They're dead. Oh my God. The brothers Lyle and Eric arrived at the scene to find their parents brutally murdered. Their cries of anguish rang through the phone. a chilling testament to their shock, or so it seemed. The Menendez brothers portrayed themselves as grieving sons, lost in their own tragedy. For a time, the public and the police accepted their grief. But as days turned into weeks, some began to wonder, was it all an act? Had the brothers truly lost everything that night? Or were they concealing a secret more twisted than anyone could imagine? The police meticulously combed through the crime scene, searching for any clue, any sign of an intruder. But what they found was strange. There were no signs of forced entry, no robbery, and no identifiable DNA left behind. Then, something strange caught their attention: the brothers' sudden spending spree. Just days after the murders, Lyle and Eric Menendez were living lavishly, splurging on Rolex watches, designer suits, and even luxury sports cars. This wasn't mourning, this was something else. Detectives began to question the brothers' behavior. Who goes on a shopping spree after their parents are murdered? Soon, the pieces began to fall into place, and what they uncovered would unravel everything. The new, lavish lifestyle raised suspicions. Could it be that these grieving sons were simply greedy? With pressure mounting, the Menendez brothers began to break down. They revealed a darker, more disturbing story of abuse and control. They claimed their father, Jose Menendez, had been a tyrant, a father who demanded perfection, a father who left wounds invisible to the outside world. But as Eric and Lyle continued to talk, they confessed to something even darker, a cycle of abuse that ran deep. They alleged years of emotional, physical, and even sexual abuse at the hands of their father. They claimed that, on that fateful night, they'd reached a breaking point. "I thought he was going to kill us, we didn't have a choice." The murders, they argued, weren't driven by money or greed, but by survival. Was it the truth, or a desperate attempt to escape justice? These haunting questions would drive the public into a frenzy. The trial of Lyle and Eric Menendez became a media circus. America watched as the brothers detailed their pain, their fear, and their justification for the murders. The defense argued they were victims, pushed to the edge by a monstrous father. But the prosecution painted a different picture. This was cold-blooded murder, driven by greed and ambition. The nation held its breath as the jury deliberated. Finally, the verdict was read: guilty. Lyle and Eric Menendez were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But even as the courtroom settled, the public's opinion remained divided. The justice system had spoken, but for many, the case left more questions than answers. Were they monsters, or were they victims too? The Menendez brothers' case endures as one of the most polarizing and heartbreaking tales in American crime history. To this day, people continue to debate: was this the tragic story of two sons pushed to the edge? Or was it a cold-blooded murder for wealth and freedom?
Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into a case today that I know a lot of you have probably heard of, the Menendez brothers. It's one of those stories that just grabbed the nation's attention back in the late 80s, and even today, it still sparks a lot of debate.
Oh, absolutely. It's got all the elements of a true crime drama,
Yeah.
Wealth, privilege, a shocking double murder, and then the trial itself, it was like something out of a movie.
Right. And it all went down in Beverly Hills, 1989, the kind of place you wouldn't expect something like this to happen.
Yeah, picture-perfect family, living the California dream, and then boom, their lives are shattered.
And the source material we're looking at today, it really lays everything out, almost like a documentary script, taking you through the events, the investigation, the trial.
It's fascinating how it pulls back the curtain on this seemingly perfect family and reveals this whole other side of the story.
So let's get right into it. What makes this case so much more than just a whodunit?
Well, I think what sets this case apart is that right from the start, the crime scene itself told a different story.
Okay, you're gonna have to explain that one. What was it about the murders of Jose and Kitty Menendez that was so different?
Just the sheer brutality of it. I mean, this wasn't a robbery gone wrong or anything like that. Jose and Kitty weren't just shot. They were completely riddled with bullets.
Yeah, the source material describes the scene in detail, and it's pretty gruesome. Jose's face was practically unrecognizable from all the shotgun blasts.
Exactly. That level of overkill, it immediately suggested this was something much more personal. This wasn't about silencing them. It was about something much deeper.
So right off the bat, investigators were thinking, this isn't your average crime.
Right. And there were other things that didn't add up, like no signs of forced entry, no other suspects. It just wasn't adding up.
And then you have Eric, the younger brother, making that frantic 911 call.
Oh, yeah. That call is chilling. You can hear the terror in his voice, the shock. He's crying, saying, "Someone killed my parents."
It sounds so real, so genuine, but then, in the weeks after the murders, the brothers' behavior starts to raise some eyebrows.
Yeah, let's talk about that spending spree. I mean, instead of mourning quietly, they're out buying Rolex watches, designer clothes, expensive cars, like they just won the lottery.
And this is where the cracks in the facade start to show, right? This wasn't the behavior of grieving sons. It was almost like they were trying to erase the past, build this whole new life funded by the tragedy itself.
It's definitely a red flag. And for the investigators, it was a huge turning point in the case. They started to question everything the brothers were saying.
And that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating. The deeper you go, the more twisted this story gets, and you start to realize just how little you really knew about what was going on behind closed doors in that Beverly Hills mansion.
And under all that pressure from the investigation, the brothers, they finally cracked.
And the story they told, let's just say, it completely changed the narrative.
Yeah, Lyle and Eric claimed that their father, Jose, was abusive. And I mean, really abusive.
This wasn't just like strict parenting or something.
No, not at all. We're talking about years of alleged physical and sexual abuse.
Yeah, the source material really delves into their confessions, and it's pretty disturbing stuff. They describe being forced to perform sexual acts on their father, enduring beatings, just constant fear.
It's a really dark side to this seemingly perfect family, Behind all that wealth and privilege, there's this undercurrent of terror.
It's hard to even imagine what that must have been like for them growing up, trapped in that kind of environment.
They claimed they were living in constant fear, always walking on eggshells, never knowing what their father might do next.
So their defense was essentially, they snapped. They acted in self-defense because they felt like their lives were in danger.
That's right. They argued that on that night, they truly believed their father was going to kill them.
But of course, that raises a whole other set of questions, right?
Absolutely, because then it becomes a matter of, were they truly victims driven to this desperate act? Or were they manipulating the situation, using this story of abuse as a way to escape punishment?
And that's what made the trial so captivating. You had these two young men, these brothers, wealthy, privileged, accused of murdering their parents, and then they tell this horrifying story of abuse.
It was a media frenzy. The trial was broadcast everywhere. People were glued to their TVs trying to figure out, who were these guys? Were they monsters or victims?
It really divided public opinion. You had people who completely believed the brothers, who saw them as these sympathetic figures who had finally escaped a nightmare.
And then you had others who thought they were just cold-blooded killers, using this abuse story as a way to get away with murder.
It was a real clash of narratives, and it was up to the jury to decide which one they believed.
the stakes were incredibly high. I mean, we're talking about 2 young lives hanging in the balance, and the whole nation was watching, waiting to see what would happen. It really makes you think, doesn't it? I mean, if this kind of abuse could happen in a family like this, with all their wealth and status.
It's like it could be happening anywhere and we wouldn't even know.
Exactly. Yeah. It really challenges those assumptions we make about people based on their outward appearance.
Right. And it makes you wonder how many other cases are out there where abuse is hidden behind closed doors, where the victims are afraid to speak out or they're not believed.
That's the really heartbreaking part of it all. You know, even if the brothers' claims were true, the abuse they suffered doesn't excuse their actions.
Of course not. But it definitely adds another layer of complexity to the case.
No doubt. And the jury, I mean, they had to grapple with all of that, weighing the evidence, trying to separate fact from fiction, and ultimately deciding the fate of these 2 young men.
And what was their verdict?
Well, after all the testimony, all the evidence, the jury found both Lyle and Eric Menendez guilty of first-degree murder.
Wow.
Yeah. And they were both sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
So even with a verdict, even with a sentence, there are still so many unanswered questions, right?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's why the Menendez brothers case continues to fascinate people all these years later, because it's a story about family, about abuse, about the dark side of the American dream.
It's about the secrets we keep, the lies we tell, and the lengths we'll go to protect ourselves or to get what we want.
And it forces us to ask ourselves some really tough questions about justice, about morality, about how we perceive and judge others.
It's a case that stays with you long after you hear about it. And it's one that, as we've seen in our deep dive today, has so many different layers to uncover.
There's no easy answers, no clear-cut good guys or bad guys.
It's a story that challenges our assumptions and forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about human nature.
And that's why I think it's a story worth revisiting, even after all these years, because it's a story that still has a lot to teach us.
Well, that's it for our deep dive today, but we want to hear from you. What did you find most surprising or thought-provoking about the Menendez brothers case? Did your perception of them change as we explored the different layers of this story? Head over to our website or social media and let us know your thoughts. And as always, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into a case that I think a lot of people are familiar with. The Menendez brothers case.
Yeah.
Back in 1989, August 20th to be exact, Jose and Kitty Menendez were found murdered.
Right.
In their Beverly Hills mansion. And of course, very quickly, their sons, Lyle and Eric, became the prime suspects in the case. But this deep dive isn't really about just, figuring out who did it.
Right.
It's more about why.
Exactly. It goes much deeper than just whodunit.
Right.
We're dealing with a lot of source material here. We've got articles, court transcripts, there's some psychological analyses of the brothers, even opinion pieces from back then. So we're really going to be trying to unpack a whole world of family secrets, disturbing allegations of abuse, and of course, this question of wealth and privilege. How much did that play a role?
Yeah, and we're looking at a puzzle where it seems like every piece contradicts the next. You look at the crime scene, it's horrific.
Yeah.
I mean, shotgun blasts at close range, the level of violence. I mean, what would drive someone to that?
Well, and that's what's so fascinating about the crime scene. It can tell us a lot about potentially the perpetrator's state of mind, the overkill, the fact that both Jose and Kitty were shot in the knees.
Oh, wow.
Forensically speaking, that suggests a very personal attack, almost an execution style. It wasn't just about silencing them. It was about inflicting pain, sending a message.
And there's no sign of forced entry. There wasn't a robbery. So this really looks like something that was planned out. It was premeditated. It wasn't just some random act of violence.
Exactly. Which is why I think it's so interesting to look at the brothers' initial reactions after the murders. With the 911 call that Eric made, and he's frantic, he's distressed, he sounds just like a grieving son. And for a while, that's how the public saw them. These 2 young men who just lost their parents in this senseless act of violence. But then things took a very strange turn.
Yeah, it's like a switch flipped. And suddenly they're spending tons of money. Designer clothes, luxury cars, Rolex watches. I mean, that's not exactly how you'd picture someone who's grieving, right?
No, it was jarring, to say the least. And it really started to raise questions in the public's mind. Like, were they genuinely mourning? Or was this an act? Was it a way to kind of deflect suspicion?
Right.
And remember, this is the 80s. It's the era of greed is good. And the prosecution definitely used that lavish spending to paint them as these cold-blooded killers, right? They were motivated by money. But then the defense, they threw a curveball.
Yeah.
The abuse allegations.
Yeah, so Lyle and Eric claimed that they'd been abused by their father, Jose, for years.
Right.
And we're not just talking like, a little bit of abuse here and there. We're talking emotional, physical,
Right.
even sexual abuse.
Yeah, they painted this picture of Jose as this tyrannical father, somebody who demanded perfection and used fear and intimidation to control their lives.
And, you look at that bigger picture and it kind of throws a different light on the whole case.
It does.
Because suddenly the motive isn't greed anymore, it's survival.
Right.
I mean, put yourself in their shoes. If you truly believe that your life is in danger, that your abuser is going to kill you, what would you do to protect yourself?
Yeah, I mean, that's what the defense really wanted the jury to think about. They argued that Lyle and Eric were essentially in a fight for their lives.
Yeah.
That this was self-defense, even if it wasn't, like a clear-cut case of it.
So it comes down to this. Were Lyle and Eric driven by greed, like the prosecution said, or were they victims of abuse, pushed to the edge and just trying to survive?
Right. It's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And the trials, they became media frenzies. I mean, the entire nation was glued to their TVs watching these two very different narratives play out. And in the end, it was really a battle of credibility. Whose version of the truth would win?
As we go through this, as we look at the evidence and we look at, the psychology of advice and the legal strategies that were used, I want you to kind of put yourself in that jury box. Could you separate fact from fiction? Could you say with absolute certainty, were they cold-blooded killers or were they victims who were just driven to do something desperate?
Yeah, I mean, because in this case, the line between guilt and innocence, it's really blurry.
It is.
And I think that's the power of this story. It makes us ask really uncomfortable questions about justice, about family, about the fact that human beings are capable of, such great love, but also unimaginable violence. And, we can look at the evidence, we can scrutinize the testimonies, but we may never really have a satisfying answer.
Okay, so let's rewind back to that night in Beverly Hills.
Okay.
Let's go back to the crime scene. Let's try to piece together what happened and see if we can start to untangle this web of truth, lies, and the search for justice.
Let's do it. Let's paint a picture here. It's August, late at night. We're in Beverly Hills, this massive mansion. It's a symbol of success. But inside, it's a nightmare. Jose, he's on the couch in the living room, shot to pieces with a shotgun.
It's brutal. Reading about it is one thing, but to imagine the terror, just how awful that moment must have been. And then Kitty, she's trying to get away, but she's shot too.
It's a level of violence that says so much, doesn't it? And it wasn't just a couple of shots. The place was a disaster. Shotgun shells everywhere, blood on the walls, the furniture, even the ceiling.
Like a horror movie, except this really happened, this picture-perfect family. It ends in this bloodbath. What could lead to something like that?
And this is where those abuse allegations from the brothers, they really changed things. Lyle and Eric, they said the violence that night, it came from years of abuse from their father.
Jose, they said he was a monster, that he was controlling, abusive, beatings, manipulation, even sexual abuse. Horrific stuff.
Yeah, the defense really pushed on this. Their argument was that the brothers, they were made to believe their lives were constantly in danger. Like Jose could snap at any moment. Two young men trapped. They had to do something to survive.
It makes you think, if you were convinced someone was going to kill you, wouldn't you do anything to stop it?
Exactly. And they had experts testify about abuse, how it messes with your mind, makes you feel like you're always in danger, always afraid. They said Lyle and Eric were just reacting, pure instinct to survive.
But the prosecution, they didn't buy it. They said the brothers made the abuse up, that they were greedy, they wanted the money, that was it. The spending sprees, no sign of being sorry, the way it was planned out, it all pointed to something darker, they said.
So the jury had to decide. Do they believe these were abused kids pushed too far? Or was it just about the money, like the prosecution said?
It's a tough question. Two completely different stories. How do you figure out the truth? Both sides seemed to have good arguments, and they both had evidence to back it up.
That's how the justice system works, right?
Yeah.
Trying to put a puzzle together, but some pieces are missing. People who saw things might not be reliable. And you got to decide based on what you can really prove.
I'm curious, do you think those abuse claims, were they true, or was it just a way to get away with murder?
That's up to each person to decide. I can't tell you what to think. But back then, thinking about child abuse, especially in rich families, people didn't really understand it like they do now.
Makes you wonder, if this happened today, would people see it differently? Now we know more about how abuse can affect people.
Definitely. That defense argument about imperfect self-defense, maybe a jury now would get it more. We understand abuse victims. They don't always do things that make sense to someone who hasn't been through that.
It's true. Standing up to an abuser, especially in your family, someone with power, that's got to be so hard. So much fear.
Yeah. We can't say for sure if the brothers were abused or if they were just really good at lying, but it was complicated. And back then, people didn't understand it all.
This case is so interesting because it makes you think about these tough things, families, abuse, and what is justice anyway. All these years later, people are still arguing about it.
It gets under your skin. Makes you question everything you thought you knew about right and wrong, guilty or innocent. And sometimes, even with all the evidence and all the talking, the truth, it's still hidden in this messed up family history.
So we've talked about that night, the abuse claims, what the lawyers were doing, but we got to talk about the trials themselves.
Oh yeah, those are insane.
Yeah.
Everyone was watching, arguing about rich people, the justice system. It was a circus.
Okay, let's come up for air for a sec. When we get back, we're diving into the trials, what the jury decided, and what happened after. Stick with us.
Okay, so we're back. And you can't talk about the Menendez brothers without talking about the trials. It was like the whole country was obsessed.
Yeah, the media was all over it.
Yeah.
Every channel, every newspaper, it was inescapable. And everyone had an opinion, were they victims or were they just evil? It really captured that, that fascination people have with true crime, with seeing how the other half lives, all the dark stuff that goes on behind closed doors. And in the courtroom, you had these two completely different stories. On the one side, you had the prosecution, and they were all about cold, hard greed, spoiled rich kids who murdered mom and dad for the inheritance. End of story.
Right. They hammered on that spending spree after the murders. No remorse, just living it up. That's what the prosecution wanted the jury to see.
And then there's the defense. Their whole case was built on this imperfect self-defense idea that Lyle and Eric really thought they were going to die, even if it wasn't like a clear and present danger.
And they had experts come in and talk about how abuse works, how it can distort your reality, make you do things that seem crazy to anyone who hasn't been through it.
It's a powerful argument, and it convinced some people. But the jury, they found both Lyle and Eric guilty. First-degree murder, life in prison, no parole.
And even after the guilty verdict, people were still arguing. Some thought justice was served, plain and simple. The brothers got what was coming to them.
But others thought it was too harsh. They felt like the jury didn't really get the whole abuse thing, how trauma can make you do things you wouldn't normally do.
Yeah, and it raises some big questions about the justice system in general. Can a jury really understand what goes on in a messed up family?
Mm-hmm.
Can they truly grasp what trauma does to people?
And you gotta wonder, how much did being rich and famous affect the case? Did it change how the police looked at things? Did it influence public opinion?
No question. I mean, the Menendez brothers, they had top lawyers, resources most people could only dream of. It makes you think, does everyone really get a fair shake in court? Or does money tip the scales?
All these years later, this case is still relevant. It makes you question everything you thought you knew about families, about right and wrong, about how much darkness can hide even in the wealthiest homes.
It sticks with you. Makes you think about the good and the bad in all of us, and reminds you that sometimes the truth is really hard to find, no matter how much evidence you have.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the Menendez brothers, I gotta ask, what do you think happened? Greed or desperation? Were they monsters or victims? Maybe a little bit of both.
There are no easy answers here. It's messy, it's complicated, but that's what keeps us coming back to these stories, right? Trying to understand the darkest parts of ourselves, the things we don't want to believe are possible.
Thanks for joining us on this journey. It's a heavy one, for sure. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into a topic that'll make you think, question, and explore the complexities of our world.